Everybody, and welcome to the 33rd rendition of the Holocaust and Genocide lecture series. I'm Diane Parness of the Political Science Department. I'm delighted to have teaching with me this semester Professor Cynthia Boas, also in political science, and Professor Myrna Goodman, Emerita, formerly of sociology. We're very excited about the lineup we have to bring to you this semester. We have some outstanding speakers, and we have topics that we've never considered before in the Holocaust and Genocide lecture series. So we're evolving, we're changing, and that's exciting. Over the next few weeks, you'll hear from many of Sonoma State's own best and brightest, our own faculty. They really provide the foundation for this course. And in addition to those speakers, we have several guest speakers who have appeared in this lecture series, sometimes for many years, sometimes most recently, and they are some of the best that we've had. That's why they're coming back. So you will hear firstly from Sergio Laporta to speak on the first genocide of the 20th century, the Armenian genocide. You'll hear from Professor Alex Alvarez of Northern Arizona University on, I think, a very stimulating and exciting topic, and that is climate change, border wars, and the provocation of genocide. It is certainly something that we see in the newspapers every day. We will also have, and I'm very delighted to welcome him back, Irfan Mirza, who was present during the Bosnian genocide and has an amazing tale to tell of his experience on those killing fields. Speaking of killing fields, we will have, for the first time here, Dr. Song Tan to speak of the genocide in Cambodia. We will welcome back one of our finest speakers, giving the Robert Harris Memorial Lecture, Professor Carol Rittner, who will speak to us on the question of gender and genocide. And wrapping up this semester, we'll have Professor Wendy Lauer of Cornell University speaking at Claremont University, speaking on Hitler's Furies, Women in the Nazi War Machine. So all of those are going to be very provocative. We will also welcome back one of our all-time favorite speakers, Professor James Waller, who addresses one of the most fundamental questions of our purpose this semester: why do people become evil? So don't miss any of those. That about is the whole semester. So we'll expect to see you again and often. Today, we are very pleased to welcome for the first time Professor Nick Underwood, who is currently teaching in our own Jewish Studies program here at Sonoma State. Professor Underwood has come to us and will receive his doctorate very soon from the University of Colorado at Boulder. He has received a fellowship from the YIVO Foundation for his research on Jewish life. His scholarly work is going to appear this year in French Politics, Culture and Society, Urban History, and Eastern European Jewish Affairs. Professor Underwood begins our lecture series today by providing the context for our discussion of the Holocaust. So to speak of Jewish life in interwar Europe, please welcome Professor Nick Underwood.
All right. So thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. It's a pleasure and an honor to be involved in this lecture series. I started teaching in the Jewish Studies program last year, and I've heard wonderful, wonderful things about this program, not only from other faculty members, but students that I've had in class. So it's a real honor to be asked to be here with you today. So thank you, Diane, and thank you, Myrna and Barbara as well, for all the wonderful support and all the work that I know goes into. There's a lot of work that goes into a class period, but getting outside people and coordinating schedules and everything is very difficult, so you are to be commended for putting this wonderful, wonderful program together this semester. Today, what I thought we would talk about to start the semester on Holocaust and Genocide is to really talk about what was lost as a result of the Holocaust. And we're going to talk about a lot today. Hopefully not too much. We'll be able to digest and think about a lot of what's being presented, but I really want to give you a sense of kind of what Jewish life was like politically and culturally. I'm a cultural historian, so we're going to be a bit more on the culture. What was lost and what people were doing between World War I and World War II. Some things I want us to consider today are how Jews in interwar Europe started to balance their identities as being both Jewish and having something to do and involved with the larger national identity of the area in which they found themselves. So whether it's a Franco-Jewishness or a German Jewishness or something along these lines. I want us to think about how integration starts to take hold, mainly through cultural productivity, but also through engagement with certain political movements that we'll talk about. Well, and then when we're thinking about these sorts of things, something that I wrestle a lot with in my research is what takes precedence? Is it the culture? Is it the politics? Is it a mixture of the two? And what is the relationship between those two happening? We can talk maybe more about this in the Q&A. It's a very popular and very heated and sometimes contested topic to talk about. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? What role does culture have in establishing communities? So in the wake of World War I, and we'll talk very briefly about the post-war period and what has changed. We're having, especially in Eastern Europe, we have many Jews scrambling to stage, as I say, stage new communities in Europe through a variety of ways that we'll talk about in a minute. What type of political presence or power do we see Jews having in interwar Europe? It depends on where we talk about them, and so hopefully some of that will come to light today. And how did Jews respond to catastrophe in the wake of rising anti-Semitism during the late 19th and early 20th century? Unfortunately, and perhaps this is how all historians will answer questions for you, in order to answer the interwar period, we have to go back. Right? Everything has a history. So we will start actually in the late 19th century very briefly to kind of get a sense of the rise in what some people now call modern anti-Semitism and the developments in that and how that starts to actually catalyze new ways of Jewish communal and political organization that comes to fruition and comes to a peak during the interwar period. Like I said at the outset, we're going to take a look at both at Eastern Europe, France, and we will also spend time looking at Germany. We will take more of a political look at Germany too, because it's important to understand the contours politically of Weimar Germany, especially in a semester dedicated to studying both Holocaust and genocide in the 20th century. And we want to, again, look at the ways and how Jews started to integrate into these societies. So again, in order to really understand, or I would claim in order to really understand the interwar cultural and political phenomenon of Jewish life, we really have to go back to the turn of the century. And we have to begin to understand the rise in anti-Semitism that happens not only in Eastern Europe as a result of pogroms in the wake of Alexander II's assassination in 1881, but also what happens in France as a result of the Dreyfus Affair, which takes place, the entire affair from 1894 to approximately 1906. And we want to think about what happens to these communities. To paint very quick pictures, in 1881 there is a wave of pogroms that are, pogrom is primarily a Russian-based word that means, a good definition would be basically violent attacks on Jewish communities, for lack of a more sophisticated definition. And they can be large and small. People can use the word pogrom to mean large pogroms like Kristallnacht, something that you'll learn about later on the semester. And also some smaller pogroms have happened during the early 20th century. But it's basically a violent attack on Jewish communities. And this happens in the wake of the assassination of Alexander II in the Russian Empire. Jews are blamed for his assassination because of their supposed, and also not so supposed, connections to the left, which they think is destabilizing the Russian Empire, and as a result, unleash these attacks on Jewish communities in Eastern Europe. Around the same time in Western Europe, in France, we have the Dreyfus Affair, which happens in Paris, France. The birth of universalism, the center of modernity, envelops itself in an affair that centers on the decommissioning of a high-ranking naval French officer by the name of Alfred Dreyfus, who was accused of treason, of selling military secrets to the Germans. It's wrapped up in this huge public debate. There are the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards. And it basically centers on the French government's targeting of Dreyfus because of his Jewishness. Interestingly enough, in all of Dreyfus's letters that he winds up writing back and forth through his wife after he is exiled, which is part of what happens to him during this trial, not once does he nor his wife mention his Jewish identity. This is a debate that surrounds Jewishness, but the person involved at the center of it actually does not acknowledge it. Perhaps we could talk about that later on, or maybe not. But this is very important, that this is a moment when not only the people involved, but society as a whole is talking about what it means to be a Jew, what is anti-Semitism, and what it means to attack people based on their religious or what some may call during this period ethnic identities. It is during this period that Émile Zola, one of the most famous late 19th, early 20th century French authors, pens his very famous script, J'accuse, to the president of the Third Republic, which is the republic in power in France at the time, and creates this moment, again, like I said, dividing society against those who are for Dreyfus, who do believe wholeheartedly that, and they are right, that he was wrongfully accused, and those who think that he was treasonous. Some historians actually call this the anti-Semitic moment in France in 1898, when there is a large, this comes in the wake of Zola's publication. Can you hear me? Still? No? Yes? A little bit? All right. There we go. Now you can hear me. That comes in the wake of the publication of Zola's piece, J'accuse. Divides France, and it becomes a lasting legacy throughout France, going up through World War II. Dreyfus, the affair, these are things that pepper French political discourse throughout basically 1940. And it's also with this moment that we see a turn away from something that some historians refer to as a moment of anti-Judaism, so more kind of a historical-based hatred of the Jews based on religion, to something that is more ethnic, or one might say racially based, so anti-Semitism. So this is the moment when we start to see what historians start to call modern anti-Semitism. These two moments are important because they catalyze what I'm highlighting here are some Jewish responses to these increases in anti-Semitism. In Eastern Europe, we start to see political responses, such as the rise of Jewish socialism, which we'll talk about in just a moment. In the West, in mainly France, we see an increase in Jewish advocacy and philanthropy as a way to kind of build up their portions of society. Also, this begins many, many waves of migrations, not only from Eastern Europe, but from other parts in Europe too. Jews are going to Central and Western Europe, and we'll talk about that some when we're talking about France and Germany. And Jews are making their way also to Latin America and New York as well. This is how you get Yiddish-speaking communities in both Buenos Aires and Mexico City. This is also happening at a period in Europe when we have the rise of nationalisms. And as a result, and we'll talk a little bit more about nationalism in just a second, as a result, Jews start to identify, specifically in the East, with new forms of nationalism. We have diaspora nationalism, Zionism, and autonomism. We are going to spend most of the day today talking about diaspora nationalism because for our purposes, it is heavily influenced in not only the politics of various countries, but also heavily involved in the rise of very, very specific and very forceful cultural movements in Eastern, Central, and Western Europe. The tying, or the key component that ties all of these diaspora nationalist movements together is their use of Yiddish that we will talk about in just a second. So the rise of Jewish nationalism. It is during this period, the late 1850s, again, we're going back from the interwar period. Late 50s through the 1910s is more or less where the beginnings of Jewish nationalism come. We have the end of the Haskalah, which is the Jewish Enlightenment, which advocates for secularization, and there is a gender revolution within certain Jewish communities. It is here that we start to see people identifying as German citizens of the Jewish faith in the mid-19th century and a little bit earlier. We also have during this period the rise of populism, nationalisms like I mentioned, and also socialism. We have an increase in Jewish population because, and also along this period because of primarily the pogroms that are happening and elsewhere, the birth of mass Jewish migration. In the mid-19th century, we see also the dispersion of socialist and communist thought, most notably through the publication of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' The Communist Manifesto. We have the rise of capitalism, which through the Industrial Revolution starts to destroy the economies of the shtetl, which are small towns in Eastern Europe. We'll talk about them a little bit more in just a moment. And we have this so-called crisis of modernization. What are Jews to do with these new isms that are popping up in the 19th century? How are Jews supposed to organize themselves or rethink their presence within these societies that are changing dramatically? The ideas of Russianness and Polishness and all these Germanness, Frenchness, all these national identities are starting to pop up, and how is it that Jewish communities try to fit within these parameters? We start to see nation and state building. Germany and Italy unify in the late 19th century. And as well in Eastern Europe, especially after World War I, we see Eastern European states clamoring for nation-state status. Through all of this, we have Jews searching for their language, which there are two that get debated, and their own culture, primarily in Eastern Europe. We're going to focus on one of those two languages that I spoke about. There's, of course, one that many perhaps are familiar with, modern Hebrew. It is a language that is still spoken today. It originates around the turn of the century and around this period. But another language that was by far the most widely spoken language at this period is Yiddish. And along with Yiddish comes this rise of what historians, and I agree with, called Jewish diaspora nationalism. In the wake of the failed 1905 revolution, which is a revolution that happens in the Russian Empire, we start to see a young generation of Jews sparked by these new ideas, all these isms, nationalism, communism, socialism, industrialization, and the effects that they are seeing these on their communities. They're affected by these, and instead of kind of going back to traditional Jewish schools and Jewish ways of life, perhaps the ways of their parents, they start to begin to embrace new ideas, whether it's Zionism and Hebraism, and Yiddishism and diaspora nationalism. Yiddishism advocated for Yiddish as a legitimate, if not only, Jewish national language, and diaspora nationalism, sought to achieve lasting Jewish cultural and political autonomy wherever they found themselves. So unlike Zionists who were looking for political autonomy but in the land of Palestine, diaspora nationalists very much were trying to make their way and their society and their cultural and political framework work within the countries that they found themselves, whether it be Latvia or Poland or Germany or in France. The major proponents of these movements are Simon Dubnov, Vladimir Medem, and Yidlamed Peretz. We won't talk about them too much today, but if anyone's interested in the topic, these are historical figures who have written a lot on this period and have some very interesting things to say. We've talked a little bit about these isms, the socialism, communism that pop up. A peculiar thing that happens in the late 19th century is the emergence of Bundism, which is Jewish socialism. Der Allgemeine Jüdische Arbeiterbund in Lithuania, Poland, and Russland, which is the general Jewish labor bund in Poland, and Russia, and Lithuania. It's founded in Vilna in 1897, and it is an advocate for Jewish socialism, so basically a Marxist political line, but with a very particular Jewish slant to it, in the sense that they are trying to organize workers Jewishly, and they do that through the use of the language Yiddish. The Bund in Eastern Europe, and they will actually wind up filtering throughout Central and Western Europe during the interwar period, is a major political and cultural force during this period. They are advocates of a specific brand of diaspora nationalism that tries to move away. diaspora nationalists and the Dubnovian sense, the one person was Simon Dubnov that we just spoke about, they're very interested in this kind of international, global Jewish national identity that is rooted in the use of Yiddish. Bundists very much believe in what they call Doegkeit, so here-ness, and they're very much interested in making this Jewish socialist Yiddish cultural project work only in the country that they found themselves. There were Bundists all over, and they were very much interested in trying to figure out how to make this project work there instead of globalizing it. Although it's a global phenomenon, go figure. So we spent some time talking about Yiddish. So what is it? It's, for lack of a better term, and my Yiddish instructors are going to yell at me for saying this, but it's a Judeo-German language, although it's not just German and Hebrew characters. It emerges around the year 1000 in the Rhineland, which is now in Germany, and it migrates east in the 14th and 16th century. So this is a language, it's actually a version of High Middle German from this period. It is associated with Eastern European Jewish life because during this period, Jews from Central Europe begin to migrate to the east. If anyone has ever heard the term referring to Jews as Ashkenazi Jews, Ashkenaz is the old Hebraic term for what we now would call Germany. So Ashkenazi Jews are Yiddish speakers, and it's because their origins are in Central Europe. Yiddish, however, because of the migrations during this period, gets highly associated with Eastern European Jewish life. They maintain this language because of, like I put up here, their lack of integration. And Yiddish is only recently being called Yiddish. I put some of the other terms up here that Yiddish has been called over the past few hundred years. And most people consider Yiddish an absorption language. Some linguists say that other than English, Yiddish has the second largest vocabulary because wherever it goes, it absorbs parts of that language and makes it Yiddish. I work specifically in Yiddish culture in Paris, and a lot of times I have to think in French as to what the Yiddish word is trying to resemble. And this happens in any place where we have there's lots of Spanish vocabulary in Yiddish in Latin America, and also Yiddish speakers in New York use English words that are made Yiddish as well. So it's an absorption language, and originally in Eastern Europe, because of Jews' demarcation from larger society, they maintain it. It becomes highly important too for our purposes because it is the tool that diaspora nationalists think ought to link people. This is, again, thinking about the rise of nationalism. How does one organize their national identity? It's either through speaking German or through speaking French. So why can it not be done by speaking Yiddish? So that's all to bring us to the interwar period. And to concentrate on interwar thought and culture, we have to recognize the catastrophic toll that World War I had on European society. If 1881 and the pogroms in the wake of Alexander II's assassination and the turmoil that happens in Europe as a result of Dreyfus affected issues of anti-Semitism, some of those issues start to come again to the fore for a variety of reasons in the wake of World War I. We see large changes in society. We have what some historians call the hollow years because of the 15 million who are killed and 20 million who are wounded during World War I, dramatically changes society. It's also during this period that we start to see large waves of Jewish migration because countries like Germany and specifically France need to get workers in there to make up for the gaps in their working in the working masses to basically just have jobs. That many young people were killed during World War I. And it's an unprecedented period of destruction, and we start to see new roles socially and culturally. There are many fascinating topics that one can explore, basics, perhaps politically or even in gender roles that emerge during the interwar period. We also start to see during this period the rise of communism, and perhaps even more broadly, a larger spread of kind of leftism, if you will, and fascism. And these two components have a lot to do with how Jewish life is being organized during this period. This is also a period that some historians have called the Renaissance of Jewish culture because we start to see a flourishing of Jewish culture in places that had not had the level of Jewish culture that it did before. There's always Jewish cultural production, of course, But it's during this interwar period, and we'll hopefully understand a little bit more why in just a bit, as we start to see new levels of Jewish culture in very interesting ways. As a result of World War I, we start to see Jews radically integrated into societies and also simultaneously marked as other, right? So this is very, very important. And again, going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, this relationship between being integrated and what that integration does for Jewish places in society. To go back again perhaps to Dreyfus and perhaps give an earlier example of this, Dreyfus was a Jew who was a high-ranking official in the French military. That level of integration was unheard of, for the most part, in Europe at that period, and it's that integration that wound up making him the outcast within society based on his Jewishness. So it's this rise in integration actually winds up paradoxically leading to this marking Jews as other within society. This is a period of large Jewish migration. We didn't talk about the Pale of Settlement at all. However, there is an area in Russia, or in the Russian Empire, for lack of a better explanation, where Jews are required to live. And in 1917, the Pale of Settlement is lifted. And so we start to see large waves of Jewish migration as a result of now people being able to move about. We have World War I and the effects on not only Jewish culture, but culture as a whole in Europe, European culture period. We see rises of expressionism, surrealism, Dada movement, the avant-garde, and all of this is kind of taking place during a period of mass migration. So we have these rises in these cultural movements along with rise in movement of actual people, and what that does to society and the new ways that people start to integrate all of these cultural forces together. We also start to see the rise of new transnationalisms. So we start to see people communicating, Jews specifically and others, communicating with groups outside of their own. So if you were involved with, and we'll see this in just a moment, the left in France, and you were a Yiddish speaker, you were as much in touch with the French-speaking left in France as you were with other Yiddish-speaking leftists in perhaps, say, Belgium or Moscow. So we have a lot here. So now we're going to transition from kind of like the prehistory of the moment to now what people were actually doing. And what is so interesting and dare I say exciting about this period, because of the level of production that people were actually involved in. And again, to go back to the beginning, this is why I think this period is so important. It's, as you know, I was telling Myrna at the beginning, it's as important to know what was lost as much as it is important to know how it was lost. And these are some of the things that we can start to recognize. There are approximately 6 million Jews at this period. The numbers are always kind of hazy here, but that's a good round number for us to think about. And spread across Eastern Europe, Poland in this period has the highest percentage of Jews to its national population, if you will. It's about 10 to 20%. And it's during this period that we start to see the formalization of some of this Jewish intellectual and cultural life. Most famously is the development of YIVO, the YIVO Institute. It's the Institute for Jewish Research. It's actually formally birthed in Berlin, but its real home and office is in Vilna. It opens in 1925, and although we talked about Yiddish beginning in the year 1000, it's around this time that Yiddish finally gets its own grammar and structure, and they start to standardize it as a language. It is what some people have called scholarship for the modern Jewish nation. So we start to see these Jewish diaspora nationalists engaging in scientific, historical, art, literature questions on Jews as a way to formalize Jews as a community, right? So if the French have the French schools that study the French, Germans have the German schools that study the German, YIVO has an academic institution that studies the history of the Jews, and primarily, not so much anymore, but in its origins, Yiddish-speaking Jews. In the wake of World War I, we have the rise of nationalist and authoritarian regimes, not always fascist, but some fascist and some fascist tendencies. And we see the hopes of Jewish autonomy quickly dashed. So in the wake of World War I, we actually see moments where some of these Jewish political parties might actually be part of the government. But as early and as quickly as 1919, 1920, and 1921, we start to see some of that hope dashed quite quickly. We see large waves of migration from Eastern Europe to Central and Western Europe beginning in 1818, 1920, and 1922, and most of those correspond to either rises in authoritarian regimes that in some but not all cases are coupled with pogroms in Eastern European cities. Eastern Europe, however, at this period is the home. It's the home of Yiddish literature, theater, and cultural institutions. If there are any Americanists in here, you're probably going to disagree with me. You might say New York. However, I will say no. It's Eastern Europe. We start to see the rise of Yiddish literature, and for our purpose today, theater and cultural institutions. So we start to see diaspora nationalist Jews in the wake of and responses to anti-Semitism and rise of nationalism and far-right political movements start to try and establish themselves as a cultural community. In addition to YIVO, which tried to do it through kind of academic, scientific research, we see groups like the Kulturliga, which basically translates as the League of Culture or Culture League, spread out across Eastern Europe, and in Paris, we'll see in just a moment, as a way to bring high culture to the masses. So we start to see these people really try and integrate everyone who speak Yiddish into this large cultural program. And it would be wrong of me not to talk about Eastern European Jewish life without some reference to the shtetl, the site of Eastern European Jewish life made famous by Fiddler on the Roof. But hopefully we can maybe demystify that in just a minute or two here, what it actually looked like. Shtetl in Yiddish means small town, and for the most part, what we think of as shtetl life was not actually the historic lived reality. These were small Jewish market towns. However, they were not primarily, or even in majority always, Jewish towns. They were mixed communities. Usually, if you ever look at old pictures of shtetls and you see these amazing old pictures that exist, you can find them in many digitized archives out there. The centerpiece is always a church. It's always it's always in the center of town. So to remind us that in Eastern Europe, the church is still a dominant figure, even in these so-called Jewish communities. However, it's important to recognize the vibrancy and the importance that the shtetl had not only for Yiddish cultural imagination, but also just for Yiddish and Jewish cultural life during this period. This image of the shtetl as being a Jewish town is actually an image of the shtetl that is being created simultaneously by some of the writers who are writing this Yiddish literature that is emerging at this time. So it's a self-constructed ideal of what the old home, even though it's not the old home, looks like. So let's move from Eastern Europe, and we'll go to Western Europe, and we'll end in Central Europe. It's a bit of a jump, but bear with me. So we're going to talk about Jews and interwar France now for a little bit. So we have all these cultural institutions, the Kulturliga, YIVO, Yiddish theater, the rise of Yiddish literature happening in Eastern Europe. And along with that, we see all these waves of migrations, the rises, of course, like I've mentioned, in anti-Semitism and the rise of right-wing nationalist parties. And as well, sensibilities based on the cultivating a Yiddish livelihood and a Jewish diaspora nationalist sense. France, and this is the topic of my own personal research. I'm still asked or told I didn't even realize that people spoke Yiddish in France. They do, they still do. This is a community that by the 1930s was about 150,000 strong, which during the interwar period in the mid-1930s is half the population of Paris. So it is the immigrant Yiddish-speaking community during this period is one of, if not the largest Jewish community in France. And what they start to do is they start to integrate heavily with actually, before I get there, I'll give you an outline of some of these groups. This is also not a fully secularized Jewish community. The Jewish communities that are so-called on the move are both as much religious as they are secular. So we have a wide variety of observance and kind of engagement with politics and life that comes along with that. However, although most of the Jews that get spoken about when we talk about Eastern European Jewish life are secular Jews, it's very, very important to recognize that not everyone was. Perhaps it's obvious, but no one ever seems to really make that observation. It wasn't just secular Jews who were trying to get away from what was happening. Everyone was. So we start to see, in interwar France, we start to see these overlaps among communities. I talked about how in Eastern Europe, Jews started to affiliate themselves with the left. In France, there is a long-standing Republican and revolutionary history. If anyone here studies history, perhaps you've heard of the French Revolution. It's a big deal. And we start to see Jews start to integrate themselves into some of those ideas and thoughts on kind of how society and culture ought to be structured. We start to see the import, too, of Eastern European Jewish cultural institutions into France and start to see them made French, if you will. We have the Kulturliga, the Arbeiterring, which is very interestingly, it's an institution that is birthed in New York. It's a Yiddish mutual aid society. Paris is the only city in interwar Europe that has both old world and new world cultural institutions in it. No other place in Europe that has both Kulturliga, YIVO, and Arbeiterring. Not many even have this many organizations, period. So we start to see the importation of Yiddish culture from kind of both sides, Eastern Europe and across the Atlantic. And we start to see these organizations become very closely tied to political movements in France. The Kulturliga, for its part in France, is housed at this beautiful, it's apartment buildings now, this beautiful old theater in the 10th arrondissement, which is not too far from the Place de la République. So if anyone's been following any of the devastating news that's been coming out of France over the past year, where all these large protests happen with it's the statue of Marianne, who's in this is a stone's throw away from that statue that most of these organizations in Paris are housed. And what we start to see is this rise in Yiddish culture in France, and what's very interesting about what happens there is that the French government, especially, there is a government structure that emerges officially in 1936 and lasts for the most part until 1938, which is called the Popular Front government in France. The French Popular Front government makes this Yiddish cultural institution one of its French houses of culture. We can talk about how that works afterwards, because it kind of doesn't, perhaps it's paradoxical and doesn't make very much sense. However, we start to see a level of integration, especially in French cultural world and the French left, with Yiddish-speaking cultural makers and the Yiddish left in France. It's a level of integration that we don't quite see in other parts of Europe. We also start to see now Paris as a real hub of both international and also domestic Yiddish theater. And we'll start to look at this in just a moment. So here are some photos that we can take a look at to perhaps slow down and actually get a sense of what was happening here and who. We don't get too much of a sense of who many of these people are, but we actually start to see people engaged in this. This is a photo from the late 1920s of a play. This is a picture of the audience, obviously. This is Theater Lancry, which is basically the center of Yiddish culture in Paris during the interwar period. And we get this glimpse into this audience. We see a commingled audience. We see people wearing very modern clothes. This is a night at the theater. We have a vague idea as to who was performing at this performance, but I have not yet been able to figure out what play it was. But we start to see a level of modernization and integration. And really, I mean, going to the theater in Paris in the 1920s and the 1930s, that's what Paris is all about, right? So we see people engaging in Parisian cultural life and starting to make connections between This is a Yiddish performance, however, they are in the center of Paris. We also start to see French speakers starting to engage in Yiddish culture during this period. This is a program from 1938. This is a play by a Soviet author named David Bergelson. This is a play of his called Die Broodmill, or The Bread Mill. And in the center, this is a 3-act synopsis of the play in French. And we know because of reviewers that there are actual French, non-Jewish, non-Yiddish speaking citizens going to the Yiddish theater at this period. So we start to see in Western Europe this level of integration that we had not really seen as much, at least, in Eastern Europe. We have on the right-hand side, this is the Yiddish. Like I said, it's written in Hebrew characters, and on the left, the cast of characters on the left, and then in the middle, like I said, a description of the play. So Yiddish is written in Hebrew characters.
Oh.
Yeah. So we could maybe talk about it afterwards, but yes, Yiddish is written in Hebrew characters. Whenever you see, for shorthand for most Jewish languages, if you ever hear Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-German, which was one of the original names for what people called Yiddish, Judeo-French, Judeo-Alsatian, Judesmo, which is now called Ladino. These are all versions, some would say dialects, of course, maybe linguists would argue with me, but just for shorthand dialects, of those national languages that are written in Hebrew characters. Yeah, and usually when you see Judeo before that word, that means that it's a version dialect of that language in Hebrew characters. So it's a way of kind of marking insider and outsider. One on the street could understand, but not read, and not maybe on ledgers or within literature, something like that. So let's stick around in France for a little while, because I like to stay in France. And let's talk about the Neue Presse for just a moment, again, to give us an idea of if something that I'm trying to show is not only this vibrancy, but this level of integration, and again, how the paradox of that integration, how these things emerge during the interwar period. The Neue Presse, which translates to the new press in Paris, is one of these moments. It's very important to kind of recognize, because this is the French Communist Party's Yiddish daily communist newspaper. It is the only communist newspaper in Europe outside of the Soviet Union. It's the only Yiddish communist daily newspaper outside of the Soviet Union. Excuse me, I was thinking inside but not spitting it out correctly. And it is published from 1934 until 1939. Like I said, in its origins, it is an offshoot, or it's a publication of the French Communist Party. It becomes quasi-independent around 1938. But for the most part, this is an initiation by the French Communist Party. There were attempts during the 1920s and earlier 1930s to establish a communist Yiddish newspaper, but none of them lasted for longer than a year, year and a half, sometimes 2 months, until the French Communist Party itself undertakes it as a mode of operation. So I want us to think about, we can either maybe take a moment to answer. I think we're doing somewhat okay on time. Maybe we can actually, what we'll do is let's think about why, and maybe talk about this in the Q&A, why you think the French Communist Party would want to start a Yiddish newspaper. Again, we're in our terms, 150,000 Yiddish-speaking Jews in Paris is a substantial number. However, when we're talking about the larger population of both French citizens, France and Paris itself, not the biggest, it's by far not the largest immigrant group in interwar Paris at all. This is one of my favorite images from the Neue Presse. This is from July 14th, 1935. This is the front page. And here, what we see is a protest. July 14th, for those that don't know, is France. It's their version of July 4th. It's national. It's their national independence holiday. Is dedicated as a celebration of the beginning of the French Revolution. And we see here this image of two very, very famous public squares in Paris. On the right is the Place de la République, the Plaza of the Republic. On the left is the Plaza of the Concorde, which is just in front of the National Assembly. And underneath it, we see a scene of protest. Here on the right, underneath the statue, it says, it's the slogan of the French Republic, liberty, equality, and fraternity, translated into Yiddish. It says Freiheit, Gleichheit, and Brüderlichkeit. And on the bottom, we see here posters that say against anti-Semitism, race, hate, and fascism. And so we start to see this Yiddish cultural group, political group, highly politicized, this is the communist paper at this period, engaging in French Republican symbolism. And this, within this newspaper too, they're talking about a huge protest that's happening in Paris at this time, and they're encouraging all Yiddish-speaking the working masses to go out and celebrate and participate in this moment. We don't have enough time to go into all of the politics that are happening in Paris at this time, but suffice to say that this is a period of increasing anti-Semitism at the time. So in the mid-1930s, although we are talking about these levels of integration, especially among Jewish, Yiddish-speaking immigrants and the French left, by all intents and purposes on the French right, we have just as much race hatred, as the sign says up there, that some of these Jews are acting against. We will leave Paris with these two images. In 1937, the Popular Front government hosted a World's Fair, and in it we had immigrant Yiddish-speaking Jews hosted the first ever pavilion of modern Jewish culture. It was up from August 1937 to November 1937. This is the cover of the guidebook that was published to coincide with the opening of the fair. And this is one of the postcards on the right-hand side that talks about the number of Jews who speak Yiddish in Paris. And they talk about, the postcard also depicts many of, it talks about Jewish salaries. It also talks about many Jewish cultural institutions that happened in the period. And here are some other postcards, although they're photographs, of the inside of this pavilion. This pavilion I have called as kind of basically the height of Jewish diaspora, Yiddish nationalism in Europe. It is the first and the last moment that we'll see Yiddish culture presented on the world stage as a contributor to modernity, modern European life, both politically and culturally. And this is all beginning and taking place in 1937. So we will kind of wrap up here at the end. It's not really too much of a wrap up because when we're talking about Germany during the interwar period, we have to spend some time, of course. So we're transitioning from France to Germany. If we talked about catastrophic loss of life, it's important to understand that what's also happening during this period in interwar Europe is the loss of land and changing borders and the effect that that can have on national identity and nationalisms. I know that you're going to talk much more about the rise of Nazism in Germany later on, so we won't focus too much on that. However, we will talk about just kind of some of the changes that are happening in Germany during this period. You can see, hopefully you can read this. It kind of marks what territories are lost as a result of Germany's capitulation at the end of World War I. I'll leave this up for just a second. I always find it an interesting image. And with the end of World War I, we start to see kind of a variety of political powers vying for authority in Germany. We have a failed German communist revolution from 1918-1919. But really what we're talking about when we talk about interwar Germany, we're talking about the Weimar Republic. And I think that you will talk about this a little bit more throughout the semester, but we're just going to give a sketch of kind of what is happening in Germany during this period, because it is extremely important to understand for purposes of this, of not only what I'm trying to present to you, but of course the semester as a whole. We have political upheaval, and as we saw in many other places in Europe, we start to see cultural renaissances and kind of an elevation of new cultural forms, not only within just Jewish communities, but within German communities at this time as well. This period is also a period that is riddled with political uncertainty. The Weimar Constitution is written in such a way that it can be dissolved by the chancellor whenever, for any variety of reasons. And I'm sure that you'll get into more some of the specifics of that later. And we also start, because of the reparations that Germany has to pay, primarily to France and some other places too, coupled with the oncoming economic catastrophe, that is the Great Depression, we start to see inflation, hyperinflation, and an extraordinarily tumultuous economic existence in Weimar, Germany. Here we see an image on the left-hand side of someone wallpapering their home with Deutschmarks because it's cheaper than actually buying wallpaper. On the right, we have a butter store and a line kind of outside of it for people to get butter. But also, this is a very interesting period of German history. Like I said, it's this flourishing of new kind of cultural means. The interwar period is also this period that some historians have called the revitalization of bourgeois life. And we see that happening very much in Germany as well. This basically like increasing again just nice things and nice life and leisure time. It's during the interwar period that we actually start to see the advent of what people would call leisure time. And so right here on the bottom right-hand corner, we have a wonderful tea set here, a moment while out on vacation. I don't know what lake this is in Germany. However, I think you get the point of what I'm trying to convey. So we have all of this kind of economic, political turmoil, but at the same time, we're seeing changes in cultural and social life that had not happened before. Perhaps it's a reoccurring theme, as maybe you've picked up on. Here are some voting numbers. Again, you can't talk about Weimar without talking about the rise of the National Socialists, the Nazi Party. If anyone wants to, I'm more than happy to share these slides with people, so don't feel like you have to memorize these or write them down or anything like that. But basically we get a sketch here of kind of the rise percentage-wise of the Nazi Party, which really starts to gain some political presence, although it's very small, in the late 1920s. And we can see I've kind of started to highlight the percentage of just the Nazi Party in the early 30s. But just for our purposes here, keep in mind that the parties that exist at the top also in one form or another exist throughout most of the Weimar period. There are some historians have actually called this one of the most democratic societies because of the amount of choice that one could have for voting. There was basically a political party that had some presence in the Reichstag that represented some political identity that one might have. Also, ironically, winds up this way that one can dissolve the Constitution also makes it one of the least democratic societies. However, this is for historians of Germany to debate, not me. We'll briefly talk about Hitler here and the rise of the Nazi Party to get an idea of how he fits into the longue durée, or the longer history of the Weimar period. We'll really start to talk, you can kind of see what's happening here at the top, you can read, but really what's important is his involvement in the rise of the party in the early 1920s. He is involved with what is now referred to as the Beer Hall Putsch, which basically putsch is a German word for more or less coup. That happens in November 8th and 9th of 1923. He is imprisoned as a result. He quote unquote writes. He dictates basically Mein Kampf, and that's when he composes it. I guess compose is probably a better word. He doesn't actually write it. He dictates it to somebody. And by 1934, this book has sold 240,000 copies. And if anyone is actually following any of the controversies in Germany right now, it has actually just been re-released for the first time since it was banned in the wake of World War II for the first time. It's a notated edition. I have not read it. I don't know from other than what I've read. To give us a sense too, the National Socialist German Worker Party, this is the long name of the Nazi party. And Hitler does not become leader of this party until 1925. So just so that you know, we see someone kind of rising through the ranks. The party did exist before he came along. But he becomes the party leader in 1925. And as we saw, they start to make most of their political gains in the early 1930s. And then Hitler is appointed chancellor on January 30th, 1933. So that is just to kind of table a very important part of interwar European political history, because it is extraordinarily important for both our understanding of the Holocaust, but also our understanding of Jewish life in Weimar Germany. By this period, in the interwar period, we have about 564,000 roughly German Jews. It's less than 1% of the population. About 400,000 of those are Jews who are quote-unquote German. The remainder of those were refugees and immigrants who were fleeing all of that turmoil that we talked about, beginning earlier, before World War I and then after. And as a result of these similar situations that we were talking about when we were talking about in Eastern Europe and France, we start to see the rise of very different, very new, some might say exciting modes of Jewish life. One of the interesting components that actually still exists in theory today is the Lehrhaus. There's the Lehrhaus in San Francisco. It's basically a house of Jewish adult learning that puts on they would host speakers, international lecturers, and it was a very important part of Jewish communal life in Germany for Jews who wanted to integrate Jewishly, but perhaps maybe they were not going to synagogue, or maybe they were looking for new ways to explore their Jewishness. The Lehrhaus movement, which was begun by a man named Franz Rosenzweig, is some of the answers to that. We also see the establishment of a Jewish museum in Berlin. It is not connected to the Jewish museum that exists today in Berlin, although they did do just recently an exhibit on this museum. It opens in January 24th, 1933, which is 6 days before the appointment of Hitler as chancellor, and it's actually closed after Kristallnacht in November of 1938. We'll actually take a look at a picture of the entryway, but it's basically one of the earliest attempts to create a museum of Jewish life, something that we here now in 2016 are something very familiar with. There are Jewish museums all over the world. This is one of the first attempts to kind of codify and put on display Jewish life and culture in Europe. This also, I told you earlier on, we will start to see the Bund kind of traveling around Europe. During this period, the Bund archives wind up coming to Germany, so they move their headquarters from Eastern Europe, and they start to make their way. They will wind up in New York. The Bund archives will stay in Berlin for a little while. They will move to Paris in late 1933 before they're actually now at the YIVO Institute in New York City. So here are a few images of Jewish life in Germany before 1938. We have a newspaper person here on the right. We have, this is a Sukkot house. Does anyone know what Sukkot is? What's it? Thanks, Brian. Booth. This is the traditional, you build it outside to celebrate Sukkot. We can maybe talk about it afterwards. But this is a booth here in Weimar, Germany. I think it actually says the year on it. Yeah, this is spring of 1933. And then on the bottom right-hand side, we have the entranceway to the Jewish Museum in Berlin. Something that I think is very interesting and fascinating to talk about when we talk about Weimar is, in addition to Jewish life, is the way that Jewish life and Jewish culture, and specifically art, starts to come into conversation with some of the wonderful and exciting expressionist movements popping up in Weimar at the period. Here we have this is a non-Jewish painter, Ernest Kirchner. This is a painting of his from 1926. We start to see these images and these motifs of anguish and kind of desperate solitude and disconnect from society start to emerge in a lot of new expressionist paintings in interwar Germany. Kirchner is one of my favorite artists. We'll look at one more of my favorite too. And they start to get this sense of utter kind of disconnect from larger society. Kirchner and this person here, Gerd Wilhelm, would have argued that this has something to do with the rise of capitalism in Germany at the time. That's out for debate, but that's how they, as artists, interpreted this. We start to see these people kind of painted very gaunt, they're living, one might say, the high life. However, they look very disconnected from it. If there's any art historians in here, you could probably do a much better reading than I am. I'm just a regular old historian. But we start to see kind of like these images, these post-war images of despair start to show up on tableaus. And here we have Felix Nussbaum, who is a German Jewish artist, start to engage also some of those very similar sentiments. And we start to see German Jewish artists, along with German artists, really start to have a cultural dialogue and clearly in conversation with each other. Again, going back to one of the themes and one of the things I want to present today is this level of integration and how it happens specifically at a cultural level. We start to see kind of, the faces are not very clearly painted. We start to get a sense of chaos and disorganization. And these are themes and elements that pop up in Kirchner, Wilhelm, and also other artists like Otto Dix during this period. These are things that these culturalists, culture makers are clearly in conversation with each other. So just to recap, and then we could do a Q&A, because I think we're going on just about an hour now. So interwar Jewish life, I hopefully painted this broad picture of what I hope shows a vibrant cultural life. We have the rise of Yiddish culture, or another rise of Yiddish culture. The advent of diaspora nationalism in the early 20th century really starts to take hold while these Yiddish-speaking Jews start to travel and migrate throughout Europe and take hold and try to claim homes in new places. We've also seen that the rise of anti-Semitism begins in the 20th century and continues through the interwar period. Fascism is on the rise, not only in Germany, but we have fascist movements in Italy and other places in Eastern Europe as well. We have leftist movements in the rise, most notably in the Soviet Union in the wake of World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution there. But also, like I mentioned, in France, we see the rise of the Popular Front, which is a pan-leftist movement. And we have this all come together to create unprecedented integration between Jewish and non-Jewish cultural and political communities on the eve of the Holocaust. And that is what we're really trying to focus on today, is this is the life that was lost. This was what people were doing. It's very easy when we talk about the Holocaust to think about the Holocaust first and foremost, and it's obviously an extraordinarily important thing that we need to be mindful of and learn about and figure out the ways in which that we can take those lessons and translate them to current political or even just personal situations, however that might be. But it's also very important to know that this was a life that was taken away from people, and this is what they were doing. A lot of these people did not, we don't know what is going to happen tomorrow, and these were creations that were made to sustain themselves and create their communities and create life for themselves. And I think it's important to recognize that, so we have, like I said before, we know as much about what was lost as we know about how it was lost. And with that, I open it up to you. So thank you. Oops. I coughed to the wrong side. So I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has them. If Yes?
Sorry, I'm preempting the students in the course, but I'm dying to ask you this question. So can you guys hear me? Speak up a little. You've talked a lot about the theme of integration, and I wanted to go back to a little bit earlier in your presentation when I'm sorry if I didn't get this exactly right.
It's okay.
You said during the interwar period, Jews were radically integrated and then simultaneously marked as other.
Yes.
And then you mentioned that, I'm sorry to remember the exact language,
It's okay.
suggested that these were kind of mutually reinforcing trajectories, that maybe the more integrated, more radically integrated Jews became, maybe the more powerful they became in certain institutional structures, the more we saw othering, and use the example of Dreyfus.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that a little bit, particularly maybe the issue of power or...
Sure. So the question is, in case everyone didn't hear, is, so I made the comment about kind of integration and how that led to othering, and I gave the one example of Dreyfus, which is kind of the classic example of during this, of an earlier period of this, but how is this really happening and within the realm of power? And I should say this, perhaps I maybe misspoke in saying radically integrated, but still integrated is definitely correct. We don't, actually, we could talk about this in a moment, actually. Radically integrated in the French case is not that off, because it's during the Popular Front that France has a Jewish socialist prime minister, the first socialist prime minister of France, the first Jewish prime minister of any Western European country at that part. So, but Leon Blum, who is this figure I'm talking about, though, is not an Eastern European Jewish immigrant. However, he is a highly integrated French Jew who makes his way up the ranks. If we're going to focus, so we'll take Leon Blum as a side, although he's very much in France, very much a focus of the othering that happens among parties on the right. He represents all the ills that we hear in many anti-Semitic tropes about controlling media and government and capital. Leon Blum, from many right-wing parties in France, encapsulates all of that, and he has proof of it because he has made his way to prime minister. However, I think that within some of the communities that I am talking about, and I'm going to speak and stick with France. In the interwar period, in the wake of World War I, the Jews that come from Eastern Europe, there are treaties back and forth between France and many other Central and Eastern European countries, because it's how they get their workforce to come back to work in the wake of World War I. As a result, we start to see some of these Jews start to get integrated in the national trade unions and these sorts of movements. At first, it is not so much, at least on a larger scale, an issue for larger French society. But as the late 1920s and the early 1930s and the global economic crisis, it's that level of integration into the French workforce that winds up making the Jews the scapegoats for how and why it is that France is starting to deteriorate in the early and mid-1930s. So what we start to see happen, and that's why I harp so much on World War I and kind of some of the antecedents, it is that drop in population that allows for some of these immigrant Jews to become integrated into, in this one example, kind of economic life that winds up being one of the ways in which Jews are kind of marked as how and why France is diminishing economically, right? And this is probably a story that one might recognize rhetoric now, is that these Jews have been taking jobs from French citizens that perhaps French people could have done. And that is rhetoric that we start to see, especially within the economic realm. Some of these Jews during this period wind up being, they're actually, after 1927, able to get French citizenship, but we wind up seeing changes in the mid-1930s that actually start to strip some, not all, some Jews of that naturalization. Naturalization is also tied to voting, so not all naturalized Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Jews in France can vote. They have to wait 7 years after naturalization, and again, not all, but some cases. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. We start to see this level of integration, and as a result, we start to see some of that be the moment of focus for antagonisms within within society. That's a French example. There are some that would probably mirror it in the German case, but I think that kind of hopefully is kind of gives an answer to some of that. I don't know if I hopefully satisfied. Go. Well.
Do you think that that's unique to the Jewish experience? Because it's interesting to hear that, and tragic actually, to hear that greater integration is leading to, more stereotyping and, more antagonisms.
Right.
Right? It's counterintuitive.
Yes.
And I'm trying to think of other historical examples, where we might also see that, maybe with contemporaneous examples for that matter, but I don't know if you need to respond to that, but I would be curious, if you think that that's unique, or if there's something particular about that economic moment in time or something that made that particularly bad.
So how to answer this question? So the question is this what I'm describing, this kind of double helix relationship between kind of integration and kind of marginalization, unique to the Jewish case and interwar Europe? Perhaps for our purposes in Europe, yes. I would think that perhaps globally, if we were to think about it, might not be as unique. Like you mentioned, there are contemporaneous examples of it right now. There's also, in the earlier 20th century, Italian immigrants in New York, and this kind of level of integration of some of these other immigrant groups in the United States faced some, the outcome, of course, is not similar, although one might argue that here in California, the integration of Japanese communities into American society with their internment during World War II might be somewhat of a parallel, although I know that making those parallels are difficult because obviously the outcome is not the same. However, the way that people act to immigrant communities, so-called immigrant communities, and what levels of integration do for their stances in society, we could definitely find some other parallels. So I don't know if I would say unique, but at least within the European case at this moment, maybe we could say unique. I'm always hesitant to say unique because whenever we dig deeper at something, we can always come up with many exceptional, perhaps, many examples as to kind of undermine some of that. Sorry, Verna.
As a counterpoint, when you talk about Jews being integrated into, and I'm going to think about French society, although there are plenty of examples in Germany. Jewish culture and workers were integrated in France and were at the heart of the development of the French fashion industry.
Yes, absolutely.
It was the people who fled Eastern Europe,
right,
who didn't, let's say, go to the United States.
Right.
So although they may have been integrated and, as you say, then were pushed out, the influence both in Germany and in France and in other countries remained.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, so did everyone hear that? I could reiterate. So basically the point is made to kind of to counter that is the level of integration, especially in France, within the fashion industry, that Jews were very, very much so a part of, they were mostly textile workers, and very integrated in the actual creation of French, one could probably argue French culture, really. They were the ones who were making these wonderful clothes that we saw in that picture that everyone in Paris was wearing during that period. So yeah, there's other levels of integration that we talk about too. Yes?
Would you speak a little to the difference between the integration of Jews in the western parts of Europe, like Germany and France, as compared to those on the eastern parts where the integration is much less, and the separation between Jews and others in their communities is much more marked?
Yes.
And opportunities for integration are much more limited.
Yes, absolutely. And perhaps it didn't come out as clearly, but you know, when I was presenting Jewish life in Eastern Europe, I was definitely presenting a Jewish life that was devoid of some of the integration that I start to talk about when Jews migrate to Central and Western Europe. And that is absolutely key to understanding this, because very early on, like I mentioned, in the wake of World War I, some of these new nation states in Eastern Europe, Poland had not existed for approximately 250 years or so. Many of these countries, and some of them were short-lived. Lithuania is an example that was short-lived and kind of absorbed in various ways in Eastern Europe during this period. At the origins of some of those national and political movements, we start to see some political integration of Jewish autonomous political parties, but very quickly after the development of these states as actual legitimate or nation states, we start to see that integration go away very, very quickly. So the level, and so that Barbara's right, the level of integration that I'm talking about that happens perhaps in Central and Western Europe is not as much in the Eastern European sphere, although when we talk about the Soviet Union, that also kind of throws a wrench in some of these discussions as well, because one could argue that within the Soviet Union, Jews were highly integrated, although I think that other people may or may not debate with that. But yes, in the East, it's a very different case of integration than it is in Central and Western Europe. And I should also say, I emphasize integration because I think it's an interesting way to look at how immigrant Jews and also not native Jews in these areas start to develop kind of cultural productions and also political awareness and political engagement. This is not to say that all Jews during this period were integrated on this level, or this is kind of a this utopian system that we're looking at. This is, for me, just one way to really kind of analyze how some of these cultural movements and political movements were really starting to take hold within some national settings during the interwar period. Does anybody else have any questions? Yes?
I was in Prague last summer, and I got to go to some of these Bohemian glass shops, and I know that was largely, I think it was a largely Jewish-driven craft at the time, correct? I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, and maybe a little bit about what the Czech, experience was.
So, I think I might disappoint you. The question was that there was Jewish involvement during this period in the glass industry in Prague, and if I could speak some to the Czech experience of Jews during this period, and what I could say to their kind of level of involvement with other industries, perhaps within and without the glass world. So this is, do I get to, I get to pull some, let's see, I can't really speak too much to it, I apologize. This is not an area, Czech lands is not something that I have studied very much. However, I know someone who's doing excellent work on Jewish life in early 20th century Prague, so you can be in touch with her.
Part of the reason I brought it up, it just seemed like it seemed like the Jewish culture there in that interwar period was pretty rich, and I just
yeah, sadly I can't expand more. I'm sorry. Anyway, yes.
Like the whole rise of anti-Semitism and some of that, and like Europe and stuff. Was there other parts of the world too that had this kind of same rise in there? Talk about in the movements, like the migration, some of that, like Latin America. Was there stuff there, like Middle East, or other parts around the world they immigrated to that had that same kind of anti-Semitism on the rise?
So yeah, and I think so the question was, I talk about the rise of anti-Semitism in interwar Europe. Were there other places around the world where we start to see rise of anti-Semitism in other places in the world? The quick answer is yes. And perhaps one of the most, an example that might be involved in kind of some of your discussions later on in the semester is the United States. In 1924, the United States basically shut down and reduced dramatically their immigration quotas, and it has been argued that those doors are shut for reasons of anti-Semitism. You can find lots of people debate on that, but in 1924, that's also one of the reasons that during the mid-1920s, Jews stop going from Eastern Europe to New York and other places and wind up in Germany and France because the way into New York was not as open for them previously. And it has a lot to do with the fear of Jewish migration and how that might affect American society during the period, during that time. So that's just one quick answer as to yes, this is not an isolated moment of anti-Semitism on the rise in Europe. There are other places, and New York and the quotas of 1924, the shutting down of the immigration is an example of that. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could comment on perhaps the connections between the fall of post-World War I traditional monarchies and more totalitarian regimes, and the kind of social anxiety that followed in the interwar period that led to the rise of far left movements and far fascist movements that almost downplayed cultural and religious connections in terms of overtly national connections, and how that played into the rise of these kind of horrible events.
Okay, so let me see if I got this right. So the question is, to what extent did the collapse of monarchies and the restructuring of European society through this kind of like new nation state based identity, right, or political or social structure, to what extent did that feed into the rise of these extreme left and extreme right movements, whether it be communism and fascism? Is that right? Okay. So, do we have another hour? I don't know. I mean, right? I mean, so yes. I mean, absolutely. I mean, fascism in and of itself is a hyper brand of nationalism that tries to codify people through one type of national sentiment to gain political legitimacy. So the collapse of empire, the collapse of national prominence in the wake of World War I has a lot to do with how and why we see, especially fascist movements rise, and also other right-wing authoritarian who would not fit people's definition of fascism, but they still are, they're not liberal and supporters of democratic or republican institutions. The rise in nationalisms as a result of the fall of monarchies has a lot to do with how and why we see the rise of some of these more nationally based movements. With regard to the extreme left and communism, I think that it's hard, it's a little bit more difficult, I would argue, to answer based purely on nationalism, because communism in its theory thinks of itself as non-national, right? That's actually one of the reasons Jews were drawn to some of the movements on the left, because they tried to dampen the ideas of nationalism as the mode of belonging, that it had to do with kind of a working class mentality, and that is actually what brought people together. This changes, of course, with Stalin and kind of his ideas of how to organize the Soviet Union in the 1930s. However, it's a little bit more complicated with the extreme leftists, the direct effect that nationalism had to do. That being said, the direct effect of economics and complete turmoil of society has a lot to do with how and why Bolsheviks were able to gain power in Russia and with the Duma. So, all right.
Well, this isn't really fair because it doesn't have anything to do with interwar Europe. I'm going to bring you up to date.
All right, let's do it.
Kicking and screaming.
Okay.
When we look with horror at what's going on in France and Belgium, for that matter, over the past few months, much of what has occurred has been excused, if you will, by saying, oh, well, Muslims did this. This is a result of what happens when you let so many Muslims into Europe. That's where we have to focus our efforts to get them out or something. And if Jews leave France, France is without.
Right.
France is not France anymore.
Right.
But I don't buy it. And I don't think Jews buy it either. The Aliyah rates from France are at the highest ever. They're going to Israel. They're accepting Netanyahu's invitation.
Right.
What accounts for the essential anti-Semitism that is so persistent in France? I ask for someone who spent a lot of time there.
So I should say, I'll preface this I am obviously not an expert on contemporaneous political science. In France, I'm a historian, so ask me in 20 years. However, I think I can give an answer. And to that I will say actually French Jews from Israel are actually coming back. There was 15,000 that just returned. Even though the Aliyah movement, the Aliyah is the Hebrew word for immigration to Israel. It literally means to rise up. So the percentages of Aliyah to Israel are on the rise, especially since 2014, which actually predate Charlie Hebdo and November 13th. However, it's still in the lower percentages, and as we're seeing just this last month, Jews are actually starting to return to France. So that's only to complicate it even more because it's a complicated situation. But what is at root of contemporaneous French anti-Semitism? Again, without kind of, we could probably sit here and talk about this for a long time. I think it goes back to some of what we were talking about before, right? I mean, we see a level, again, of integration, and it has a lot to do. This kind of level of anti-Semitism that was happening has a lot to do with the fall of French colonies, right? There's a wonderful book that was just published by Maud Mandel called Jews and Muslims in France, and there's another book they were published within a month of each other, approximately, by Ethan Katz called The Burden of Brotherhood, and they both very much argue that it's the collapse of the colonies and the empire that starts to marginalize some of these groups in ways that start to have this disaffected youth and kind of starting to create, again, these hierarchies within French society. And French society has always had a difficulty dealing with these hierarchies because they are by definition non-existent in France, right? We don't have this. We're all equal. This is égalité, right? We're all, right? You roll your eyes. I'm not right. I'm not going to because I'm on camera. But yes, this has a lot to do with kind of some of these recreation of kind of social and socioeconomic levels in France. This is, again, not my area of research. I'm kind of just thinking through these books and these texts and what I have been reading over the past few years. So I think that it has, again, perhaps I don't know how satisfying this answer is, but I think it's going back to these questions of integration and how and in what way integrated groups can become the focus of kind of marginalization. An interesting story, and it's something that even it's something that everyone feels. I have not, like I said, I have not been to France in the past year, but even prior to that, I was told, if you are using materials that are in Yiddish, don't have them out in the metro, and people would tell me these sorts of things. So there is something, and this is, again, not the most satisfying answer, because I don't know that I know the answer to it. But I think that we're seeing the rise of new types of marginalization. I'm sure others out there are going to disagree with me, that are creating some of these new brands of anti-Semitism. There's actually debate within the French public sphere right now as to whether or not this is even a new brand of anti-Semitism at all, and whether or not this is something that has been lingering in France for a long time, ever since Dreyfus. So whether or not, again, back to this idea of integration, whether or not Jews were actually integrated to the level that Jews thought they were or not. So Diane, I don't know if that answers your question at all, but. Hold on. Yes.
Can you talk about the Balfour Declaration?
So how so?
And how it fits into the anti-Semitic view of anti-Semitism in the Western world?
So, okay, that's another big question. So the question is, can I talk about the Balfour Declaration and how it fits into the development of anti-Semitism in, I think you said, the Western world? Yeah. Maybe we should put on a book, on the books here, a course on the history of modern Israel or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or something, so we can really delve into the answer to that question. In the European sphere that we are talking about right now and today, the Balfour Declaration for those Jews who tried to integrate themselves into European life, it was not as much of a factor as it was perhaps for Zionists who were in France and Germany and Eastern Europe, of which there were many. And to the extent that it affected the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe in the period that we're talking about, I am sure that there was some consternation among some observers of the situation in the Middle East at the time, where we haven't touched at all about Jews in the United Kingdom. However, there were enough reasons that I think we've covered to spark waves of anti-Semitism in Europe that the Balfour Declaration, in most cases, at least in the sources that I read, and I read newspapers from the 20s and 30s all the time, I don't see it pop up as much. Not to say that it is not an important factor and it's not a key or a part of this whole picture, but it is, I don't know if I would focus on the Balfour Declaration as some sort of catalyst for what we're talking about in toward Europe at this time. I don't know if that answers your question, but again, I think that we could probably sit around and with some really great texts and talk about this for a long time. Thank you for having me.